Okay, start my video. Hi, everyone. I think it's time to start. I will go ahead and I will start. Hi, everyone. I am Carolyn Gitlin, and I'm from Hartford, Connecticut, and I am the co-chair of the Large Intermediate Federations. Welcome to the session, Imagining the Future of Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us today. And for your information, recordings of this session and all other workshops will be available online after the GA ends. I hope you are all planning to join us tonight at 7 p.m. for the Federation Together Plenary. I know it is going to be quite moving and phenomenal. In a crisis like the one that we're currently experiencing, raising significant funds now is of the utmost importance. But let's spend the next 90 minutes putting our current reality on pause and looking ahead. What is philanthropy going to look like when we emerge from COVID and in the years ahead? We can spot some of the trends as they take shape. Collaboration is becoming an imperative. Technology is playing an ever-growing role, and younger philanthropists with the desire to create social change are stepping up as leaders as well as givers. Our panel today represents major Jewish and secular foundations as well as federations. What they all have in common is that they aren't waiting for the future to see how fundraising might evolve. They are at the cutting edge. And all of our speakers are donors in their lives who can speak from personal as well as professional experience. I'm pleased to announce and welcome our speakers for this workshop. Liz Fisher, who is the Executive Director of Amplifier at JFNA. Kathy Rich, the Director, Building Institutions and Networks, which is called BUILD. Rachel Sumak, the founder and CEO of Swipe Out Hunger. Dylan Tatz, the Executive Vice President of the Newton and Rochelle Becker Charitable Trust, and Jennifer Weinstock, the Senior Vice President of Philanthropy at the Combined Jewish Philanthropies. And now I will hand it over to Liz. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Thank you for being here. I'm Liz Fisher, based here in Brooklyn, New York, but from the small but mighty Jewish community in New Hampshire. I am so happy to be here today. Thank you to JFNA, and particularly to my colleagues Lindsay and Rena, who are on this call with us and who have done extraordinary work in getting everything ready for us to talk today. So in a moment, we're going to imagine together, what is the future of philanthropy? What will giving and tzedakah look like, say, in the year 2050? What are the trends of today telling us about tomorrow? I've invited some leaders and friends to have that conversation with me together this afternoon. But first, we know we couldn't ask everyone to join this conversation here on Zoom with us today. So we asked many of our friends across the United States to share what their thoughts are about the future of philanthropy. And we're going to start out with a 5-minute video sharing their ideas, and then we'll come back and we'll introduce our panelists and kick off the conversation. So let's go over to the video and we'll be back with you soon.
In the future, giving will be more diverse than ever before. People of all backgrounds will feel proud and empowered to give generously and give often because they know the value a gift of any size can bring to their community.
In the future, giving will be more collaborative, more creative, and more responsive. Just as we saw this year, grant goals were out the window, and we work collaboratively with funders to serve our artist constituent community much more deeply and in much more important ways than we had ever thought we could before.
The future of philanthropy will be based even more on trust and transparency. It won't be enough just to have a good mission and caring people, but we'll also have to be so transparent that people feel like they can trust the organization in all its capacities in new and even deeper ways.
For me, the future of giving looks like us going back to the root of the word philanthropy, which is love for the people. So for me, it's putting love back into giving.
I think, I hope, I dream that the future of philanthropy will be thousands, hundreds of thousands of engaged citizens coming together in groups to do everything they can to pool their resources, power, time, testimony, talent, treasure, and ties to make their communities better, safer, more fair, more fun, more equitable, and more just.
The future of philanthropy is thrilling. What we see is that most people give charity. The vast predominance of charity comes from average citizens of moderate incomes, and they have at their disposal new and innovative platforms and methods that enable better giving. They are all part of the philanthropic ecosystem. And we also have foundations and philanthropists that are giving in more thoughtful and strategic ways. So when I think about the future of philanthropy, I'm excited.
And to me, the future of philanthropy will be an ecosystem where nonprofits and donors can come together, where they have positive experiences around fundraising and donating.
Philanthropy
Is made
for me.
for all of us.
For all of us.
For all of us.
Why for all of us?
Well, because philanthropy is for everybody.
No, for me.
Oh, for you? Okay, for you and everybody.
I believe that the future of giving will be bold and unrestricted.
In the future, giving will not be about wielding influence or power. I believe that we can live in a world where love, equity, and justice take center stage in philanthropy.
The future of philanthropy will be energizing, collaborative, and vital for responding to challenges in our broken world.
I believe that giving will be a forethought rather than an afterthought, proactive rather than reactive, and will be done from a place of love and mutual responsibility and relationship. And most of all, I believe that everybody will see themselves as a giver. Everybody has the potential to give, whether it be a lot or whether it be a small amount. Everybody has the capacity and should see themselves as a giver.
The future of philanthropy, to me, it's more diverse, more impactful, more intergenerational, and a lot more fun. My world is women's giving circles, in which young women who are just starting out in philanthropy can interact on an equal footing with women whose names grace the sides of buildings. Everyone learns from everyone else, and we all learn a lot from our grantees.
In the future, Giving will be used as a vehicle to drive innovation, consolidation, and a new way to do Jewish.
One of my wishes moving forward in philanthropy is that our community opens their hearts and their minds to the new and evolving Federation. I feel like there's still a feeling out there that it's just a fundraising organization that calls you once a year. Federation is an incubator. It is a hub of innovation. And for me, it still remains the organization that is the most flexible and nimble to any need that comes up, being able to move, to be in the moment, and constantly reinvent itself. It's why Federation is the home for my major gift, and I hope that we can help to continue to reconceptualize the Federation product as we move forward.
The future of philanthropy is age without limits. I feel like a lot of millennials are finally realizing that you don't have to be a certain age, you don't have to be a millionaire, you don't have to be 100% established in your career yet to make a difference, to be a change maker in your community, and to have a voice that positively affects and impacts people's lives on a daily basis.
The future of philanthropy are giving circles, where our values guide our giving, and every one of us is recognized as a philanthropist, and we are really true partners to our nonprofits.
I think the future of philanthropy is distributed in terms of the people that have access to the information to give smartly, and to the recipients and the beneficiaries of that philanthropy. I think the future of philanthropy is far more informed. I just hope we understand the issues much better and we understand the inflection points to make change.
Hi, I hope that you enjoyed that video, and we'll figure out if we get you a link in case you want to see it again. I've been watching Isis and her little one over and over again whenever I get depressed because it's so sweet. I'm going to ask all of my panelists to turn their cameras on and go ahead and unmute yourselves. And Ryan, if we can maybe get a screen up with Kathy and Jennifer and Rachel and Dylan and me, that would be great. Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. So sorry, everyone. It's, technology. We're all living it every minute of every day. So the first thing I want to do is I want to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And I'd love if you could just share your name and maybe where you're zooming in from, and also something from that video that struck you. And we'll go ahead and start with Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Weinstock. I have the great pleasure of working at Combined Jewish Philanthropies here in Boston, which is the Jewish Federation of Greater Boston. And I'm so happy to be with you all today. I'm zooming in from Brookline, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston, where it's a dreary and overcast kind of day. But I'm looking forward to seeing my colleagues from California, what's happening out there. And I think the thing that stuck for me most in that video is the invitation to all of us that everyone can participate in philanthropy. I feel really blessed that Jewish tradition gives us a playbook, and that playbook shows us the way to creating an ethical and moral society at which tzedakah philanthropy is at the center. And so that video really took me back to who we are as a community and how we should be oriented, and I'm excited to dig into the topic today. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Dylan.
Hi, my name is Dylan Tatz. I'm calling in from slightly dreary San Francisco as well. I think and I'm from the Newton and Rochelle Becker Charitable Trust. I'm the executive vice president here, small family foundation in the Bay Area. I think what struck me most of all is the concept of empowerment and meaning. When I think back 50, even 100 years ago about the nature of philanthropy, it was very centralized. It was you give to your federation, you give to your synagogue, you give to United Way, and you kind of entrust them to allocate as they see fit. And recently, philanthropists, even small philanthropists like those of us as individuals, have become very empowered to connect directly with organizations and find meaning through that. And I think it has some downsides as well. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later, but that's really what struck me from the video.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Sumac. I'm the founder and CEO of Swipe Out Hunger, calling in from Los Angeles. And I really loved what Alyssa said, where she said, philanthropy is ageless, that anyone should be a giver. And I loved it so much because when you feel like you are a part of your philanthropic landscape, you feel so much more powerful. I know I feel powerful when I give. And so this notion that we can give that sense of agency to everyone at every age.
Great, thanks. And Kathy.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Rich. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York. I am director of the Build Initiative at the Ford Foundation, and Ford is a global foundation that is dedicated to ending inequality in all its forms. What I loved about the video, and it actually, the first time I saw it, it made me a little weepy, was that in this time that is so polarized and so uncertain, every voice was a voice of hope and unity and love. And I think that if we can root our vision of philanthropy in those values, the future looks really bright.
Great, thanks. So just a few kind of housekeeping things about how we're going to have the conversation today. First of all, we have shared a link to the panelists' bios with you, and I saw a note that maybe that link isn't working, but we'll have our behind the scenes IT fairies take a look at it, and hopefully we'll get it back out to you, because I've asked the panelists to jump right into content and not do so much biography. So we'll make sure that we get some more background information to you. Please share any questions you have in the Q&A. We definitely want to make this as interactive as possible, so we want to hear your questions. We want you to hold us to sort of what you think about the future. It occurs to me, as all of our panelists are introducing ourselves, we're a very coastal group, so particularly if you're in the middle of the country, like, keep us real, make sure that we're not just talking to the East Coast and the West Coast. We want to really all be in this conversation together. And I'm going to throw out questions. I've asked the panelists to, push back, disagree with each other. I kind of hope everyone's got their virtual, cocktails and mocktails in hand, and we'll just dive in. So the first question I have is, I'm curious, when you think about the trends in philanthropy today, how do they inform your thinking about the future of giving? Like, what excites you about current trends in terms of thinking about the future of philanthropy, and maybe if there's things that concern you about future trends? And we're going to ask this question of all of our panelists, but I'm going to start with you, Kathy.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you so much. I've worked in philanthropy a long time, almost 20 years, and I've sometimes been one of philanthropy's harshest critics. But this year, I'm seeing a lot that inspires me, and I'm seeing in particular 3 big trends. First is a new determination to give as much as you can, for as long as you can, and as flexibly as you can. The Build program, which I direct at Ford, gives me a huge platform to advocate for this kind of grant making. It's a 6-year, $1 billion program that offers 5-year general support and institutional strengthening grants to social justice organizations all over the world. This year, I'm seeing more and more donors giving multi-year unrestricted commitments. Build used to be the biggest game in town when it came to multi-year unrestricted funding, and I'm really happy to say that this year we have some great company. So the second trend that I think is really exciting is a new understanding among both individual and institutional donors of systemic racism and a real commitment to racial equity. The Chronicle of Philanthropy estimates that more than $5 billion has been pledged to racial justice causes since the murder of George Floyd. And we've seen high-profile commitments from both foundations and from individual donors like Susan Sandler. And finally, the third big trend that I'm excited about is this growing trend of giving in collaboration with others, from giving circles to crowdfunding to funder collaboratives that are moving hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I think in the future, we'll be giving a lot more, and it'll be more powerful because we won't be giving alone.
Awesome, thanks, Kathy. How about Dylan?
Sure, there are a couple areas I see expanding recently. One is, what I started talking about before, which is really allowing philanthropists to connect more directly with the sources of their philanthropy. And I think that's wonderful in many ways. It gives people personal meaning. I think in some ways it fosters innovation because some individual philanthropists will just find this little project, this startup organization that's doing great stuff, and really want to empower them and give them a seed grant to get up and going. But at the same time, I think we all have stories we've heard or experiences we've had where philanthropists don't know the power that they have sometimes. They'll parachute in and with the best intentions make a large gift to something and sort of upset the ecosystem. So I think that dynamic between not only principals and staff, but also sort of the hub organizations like federations, for instance, that we entrust with our giving versus philanthropists making decisions themselves, I think is really critical. And for us, that's all kind of connected with the concept of donor intent. Our founder, Newt Becker, passed away about 8.5 years ago and set up our foundation actually as a charitable trust instead of a foundation. So we have a long trust document which lays out in a lot of detail Mr. Becker's wishes for how he wanted his funds to be spent. And it puts us in an interesting situation because there are certain things that he was very clear about, even particular organizations, but there are other things where he gave us directionality. So for instance, promoting democracy around the world, which he meant in a very different way than we're interpreting it now. We're doing a lot of work in terms of promoting democracy here in the US. And in 2012, when he passed away, I don't think he ever would have thought that that would have been necessary here. So I think that sort of balance between trying to preserve donor intent with us as staff interpreting it to our own situation is really critical. And we also see in a Jewish context, we've been approached by a number of kind of older philanthropists who are of a certain generation where they're about to hand off their wealth to the next generation who might not have the same philanthropic priorities that they do about the Jewish community, about Israel, things like that. So we've actually fielded a number of incoming questions as a charitable trust. Oh, could I set that up as well? How do I do that to make sure that my intent is passed over to the next generation? So I think that's another really new, interesting field that we're going to see a lot more of in the future.
Thanks, Dylan. Jennifer?
Sure. Well, I know, Liz, the invitation was to disagree, but I guess in this first round, we're probably going to agree with each other a lot, but we'll see if we can get into something meaty. We'll try and get into something meaty later on. I'll just say a few things. First of all, I really agree with what Kathy said about flexible resources. I think that from the mid-90s till, sometime in the last several years, we saw a real focus on designated and directed gifts. And what I have seen over the last 18 months, even before the pandemic, but certainly heightened dramatically by the pandemic, with deep gratitude to the foundation community who basically said, like, if we want these organizations to not only survive, but to thrive, we cannot throttle them with all of these crazy restrictions. And what we need to do is say, like, we trust you as leaders, we trust your volunteer leadership, we believe in what you're doing, and we want to help you with flexible resources. We've seen a huge trend in the increase in flexible resources here in Boston, and I know my colleagues around the country have also seen that. And I think that that's really a case of our donor population, like understanding that we have both the historic responsibility, our federation system, and it is ever more critical. Like, our work is just as critical as it is today as it was 125 years ago. And so I'm really proud of our donors for stepping up with flexible resources. In fact, this year, we're anticipating an increased campaign in the flexible portion of our campaign, which I feel like, maybe I shouldn't have just said that in front of, I don't know how many hundreds of people are on here, including probably my boss and many board members, but I feel like this is the moment and people want to join with us in this work. The other point that I think we're seeing a lot of, and what really spoke to me in the video, is just a wider participation. At CJP in Boston, we've had some success with what I would call episodic emergency appeals, whether to help undocumented immigrants, whether to help other kind of social justice issues that we're facing. And obviously this year with the COVID crisis, and we launched an emergency fund. And we saw like about 2/3 of our donors were either new or returned, meaning they had not been regularly giving for several years. And to me, that's like a real trend we're going to start seeing. People are calling, like they want to know how they can help. How can I give? How can I volunteer? How can I learn? What can I do to really act on behalf of my community? And so I think the net for wider participation has been cast. And then the last thing I'll say is that many of our donors use donor advised funds, which is a philanthropic vehicle, not that different from the trust that Dylan was describing and probably how Kathy's foundation was set up, but they're meant for just average everyday people. And most donor advised funds at this point have very low, dollar amounts, thresholds to join in. And the thing about donor advised funds is that they allow you to save for a rainy day. And so many donors, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, were saving their philanthropy for a rainy day, and the rainy day came. And we have just seen such an outpouring of support, from our donor advised fund at CJP in Boston. I agree with Kathy, to many, many, many nonprofits outside the Jewish community that are fighting racism and all other kinds of issues of social inequity. And we're really proud that the Jewish community stamp, that our Jewish community name are on those checks that go out into the greater community. And so I think that's another huge trend that we're seeing.
Great, thanks. And Rachel.
I will round us out from the nonprofit perspective of, I've seen two big trends happening. The first is that a lot of funders are looking to actually fund solutions as opposed to just the maintenance of programs. And what I mean by that is that the words advocacy and policy change are no longer things that people are afraid of or don't understand the importance of. And I think we're just at the beginning of this. I'm hoping more funders understand that, I work in the anti-hunger world, and feeding people is one really important thing we have to do. We have to feed people today, but we also have to know how we shorten the number of people who are in line to get food. So I'm excited to see more people understanding the role of advocacy and the importance of funding that. And then also, I feel like philanthropy has become much more two-sided. And of course, in this moment of COVID, even more so. I know in early weeks of April, I was calling a lot of our funders and saying, I don't want to tell you this in a few months. I'm going to tell you now that everything has changed. And this is what's happening on the ground. This is what our students are telling us. This is what people need. And I know that I need to tell you this because there's no way you would know this otherwise. And so this intimacy and the pandemic gave us a chance to actually be a little bit more vulnerable as organizations with our funders, and hopefully have funders be responsive to that. And I feel like, we're seeing that first and foremost in the notion of listening to people on the ground. So in the world of racial justice, if you are, launching an attempt to end racism, but you don't have a single Black person on the committee, people are going to question the validity of your plan. And I think we, as an organization, for instance, at Swipe Out Hunger, we have invested in student leadership at the forefront of what we do, because if we're not listening to those that are closest to the issue, then our solutions are not going to be the right ones. And similarly, we want to model that not just for the other nonprofits in the community, but also for our funders. And we are seeing similar behavior amongst philanthropy, putting the people who are closest to the issues in leadership positions, not as a token, but because they're finally realizing, oh shucks, we haven't fully figured this out, and maybe we should be listening to people closer to the issue. And so that's been a really exciting trend in philanthropy from our perspective too.
Thanks. Rachel, while I have you in the hot seat, we're already getting a bunch of questions in the chat about sort of donors in their 20s and 30s today. And I know you work with a large group of students, right? So donors, sort of young donors or younger donors today, and how they might think about giving, or how they're thinking about giving today might influence not just how they give today, but how they might give when they're 60, 70, 80. So why don't we start with you on that question, and then anyone else who has an idea about that can hop in.
Yeah, I think that, even in this election moment, everyone is a giver. Everyone's giving, $10, $15 to campaigns or to causes. So more people are giving than ever. But from where I sit, people don't resonate with the word philanthropy who are young and giving those dollars, right? It's a notion far away from them. So I think we have to first and foremost have them realize, no, when you give that $10, or even when you give up your time, you're participating in this philanthropy world. And so, for instance, through Swipe Out Hunger, college students are able to donate the extra money from their meal plans to other college students who are hungry. We've been able to serve over 2 million warm, nourishing meals this way. And one of my favorite moments is thinking about that freshman kid who chooses to donate his 30 extra meal swipes as opposed to swipe in all of his frat brothers, which happens every day, right? So we have to present moments for people to give that are natural and a part of their regular day. And because we have our donation drives happening quarterly, it's a regular chance for people to give, that freshman year, that sophomore year when they are students on campus. And I have an expansive understanding of the word philanthropy. I think if someone is giving you real estate on their social media, if they're posting about your cause or their giving circle on Facebook or Instagram, that's a huge commitment, right? That's social capital that they're investing. And I think it starts there. People feel invested and they're like, wow, the way that I step up my investment further, it's what we do with donors, right? You give them a chance to engage with your work and then you invite them to give. And I think with young people, it has to be like very similar. Give them something appealing that they want to share about, and then give them the opportunity to give from there. And they'll be very eager and become your most committed ambassadors. And if your message isn't resonating with them, then maybe there's a problem there, right? I think people, especially young people, want to know who's the CEO behind this? What impact is it actually having? Where are those dollars actually going? And if you can't answer those questions, then figure that out before you try and appeal to young people. And don't blame it on us that we're not givers. It is because we want to know who is the face behind this, and we want to be able to relate to that face.
Thanks. Other thoughts? Anyone else on the panel want to hop in on sort of trends today with, you know, people in their 20s, teens, and how that might affect future generations of givers, or how they might rather give when they, you know, come into more capital in their lives?
I'll just add, I think some things that Rachel said really resonated with me. And I think one of the mistakes we make in the kind of legacy organization world, I mean, I know there's lots of people out there from JCCs and human service agencies and many other organizations, so we're not only bad at this at Federation, everybody has a burden here. I think that we take our young adults and we like stick them all together in a room and we want them to do young adult things. And one of the things that our young adults tell us, these people who are like very smart, they have something to really contribute to the mainstream conversation in our organization, is we don't want to only be in a room thinking about how to engage other young adults. We want to be in a room where, as Rachel just said, like the decisions are being made, where we can really understand strategy and start to figure out, like, is this a game I want to get into or not? And, you know, is this the place that the mantle that I want to pick up? And, you know, we have some rebranding to do with the next generation. And, you know, they're not just going to believe it because we tell them you should believe it. I have 3 teenage children and none of them believe anything I tell them to believe. And one of whom's on a college campus now. So thank you, Rachel. And, you know, it's we have to invite them into the conversation so that they can contribute their own voices to what kinds of organizations we should be. And that is, I think, the only way we're going to get the next generation to really share this mantle. And it is a dangerous place for all of us in the philanthropic world. You know, I have many major donors who will tell me, like, I don't know if my children are going to keep this going. I don't know if they're going to give in the same way that my parents and I have given. And I think it's our joint responsibility together to ensure that there'll be people sitting in our seats, you know, when we're not here anymore. And we have a lot of work to do there.
Share a bit from sort of the Silicon Valley perspective around here, some of the trends we've seen, which I think resonate with what Rachel and Jennifer were talking about. I think philanthropy is being done in a very different way sometimes. When I think about how Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla, when they set up CZI, they set it up as an LLC, not as a private foundation. And I think more and more you have philanthropists where I think once upon a time, the most prominent philanthropists, the biggest donors in a given community, tended to be of an older generation, tended to be maybe retired, you know, and were devoting themselves full-time to philanthropy, or it was, you know, family money, something like that. And now we see a lot of younger philanthropists kind of, they sell their company, they have an IPO, something like that, and they burst on the scene. And they have little kids and they're still working full-time, but they want to really make a difference right off the bat. And, you know, one of the things that's very common, obviously, they set up DAFs, as Jennifer mentioned, which is terrific. But I think we see the nature of their philanthropy being a little bit different. Especially around here, so many are so involved in the tech scene that they want to take bets on interesting organizations doing cool stuff. Those who are involved in Jewish philanthropy don't necessarily want to give to mainstream Jewish organizations because they want to do something a little bit different and more disruptive, to use that word. And I think also just the nature of their philanthropy is more diverse. Even if they care deeply about being Jewish, they also care about the environment. They care about, you know, the issue of race in this country. And, you know, the word intersectionality is thrown around a lot, but I think that has a really significant effect on philanthropy, where you're not just thinking of your primary philanthropic vehicle being Jewish. How can we link all of these different things together to really make it resonant? And to also think about where people are in their lives. You know, there might be life cycle events, but when you look at trends, affiliation, connection with the Jewish community is often much higher for those who are a little bit older. So if the philanthropists are no longer in their 70s and 80s, the most prominent philanthropists, how are they connected to the Jewish community in different ways? A lot of difficult questions for us to grapple with.
Yeah, thank you all. So I want to just push you all just a little bit further on this question, because what I've heard several of you say is that there's a real necessity to continue to sort of bring people into the conversation in a real way, give them agency, respect the different ways they want to give, that folks may or may not, the issues that people care about in 30 years may or may not be the issues we care about today. So what do you say to the people who say, well, then who's gonna, clean up Jewish cemeteries, and who's going to take care of old people? Like, what's your thinking about that? Like, will there be a core of what it means, specifically in Jewish communities? Will there continue to be a core of what it means to sustain those communities? Will that shift? Is it too close to call, too early to call? What do you think about that question?
I really think it's a both and, actually. And when I think about my own giving and how we talk about giving in our family, we intentionally put our DAF at the San Francisco Federation, which is our home community. And we're giving at this point to a lot of Jewish organizations. I would say the first 5 years we had that DAF, we gave only to Jewish organizations. We continue to think that's really important. And one way that we keep our children engaged in the Jewish community is by giving them a stake in those decisions, but also in making sure they know that this staff is going to stay at Federation. It's not going to go somewhere else, right? But it's a both and, because I think that we need to be expansive enough to give to non-Jewish causes and realize that that's okay, that there's a very important message in making sure that that money is going out Jewishly, right? And that it's a Jewish Federation giving it, but that it is going to speak to a broader world. So I love what Jennifer said. I think there's going to be room in the long term to sustain both our Jewish communities and for us to engage really productively and constructively in non-Jewish organizations as well. And that's what our community has done for well over 100 years.
I agree, and I'll add, Kathy, I think that I'm not worried about the core going away. Like, we have always been a people who ensure that nobody falls through the cracks. One of the first grants we made out of our emergency fund here in Boston was to the Jewish Cemetery Association of Massachusetts, to ensure that low-income people in our community who are suffering from COVID, who are losing a battle with COVID, could have a Jewish burial in dignity. Like, I told a group of young adults here in Boston that last week, and they were like shocked. They had no idea that that was part of our responsibility as a Jewish community. And so some of it is in our communication and in actually making sure that the next generation understands, like, what are the pillars of the things that we care most about that we will not compromise on. We will not let people fall through the cracks in this community, like we never have and we won't. And I think the place where there's room for innovation and change is in how we do that. Will this community look exactly as it does today in 35 or 50 years? Like, I hope not. I hope that there are some really smart people coming up behind me who have great innovative ideas of the different ways to do that work. But I think the core of who we are as a community and our commitment to each other will not go away. And so I think it is a yes and it has to be a yes and an invitation in a way that says, join us in this conversation and contribute your voice to how we could make sure that no one falls through the cracks. How can we ensure that the next generation feel connected to Jewish identity and Jewish community? What is that going to look like? It might not look like the shape of the buildings that we have today, and it might not look like the people who sit around the board tables that we have today. We all have to be open to that possibility. And I don't fear that our core will disappear. It hasn't yet.
Thanks. Let's dig in a little bit into that how, because I think it's an interesting question when we think about the future. We've touched on this a little bit already, but there was maybe a time where giving meant, charity, right? Giving meant cash from my pocket to someone else. Maybe not, but let's just imagine that there was a time where that was sort of the definition of what it looked like. Now we see people, who, a few of you have said this, people who want to have impact, thinking about their, their tzedakah, but also thinking about their activism, maybe thinking about their volunteerism, thinking about technical vehicles like charitable trusts, like donor advised funds, thinking about, sort of social purpose business. So how do you see those trends affecting the future? How much what will the role of philanthropy be in kind of overall social service and social change, in the decades to come? And I'm happy to just throw that out generally or to pick on someone. Let's start with you, Dylan, and then we'll see who wants to go next.
Sure. I think it has a lot to do with sort of the philanthropist, the grantor-grantee relationship. I think, these sort of, in-kind gifts are certainly very valuable oftentimes for organizations, but I think there are certainly times when they're a little bit more trouble than they're worth. So I think having that dialogue and that transparency back and forth to make sure that they're being given in a way that is actually helpful and useful to the organization is really important. Donating, whether it's donating legal services or donating, you have a great Twitter following, you want to tweet it out. I think just having that dialogue is really critical. And I think that's also, for the larger givers, the role of the professional staff. So people like Kathy and myself and Jennifer at CJP as well, to sort of serve as that intermediary and make sure that the intent of helping the organization really does get to the finish line and help the organization in the way that they want to be helped. But I think it's a tricky thing, because I think even if the motivations are there, you need to make sure that we're getting to a place where it's valuable to the organization. And a mutual respect, I think, is a really important part of that. I think so much has been written about, philanthropists having more respect for, the folks who are actually out there on the ground doing the work, and philanthropists not necessarily understanding what it really takes and coming in and trying to tell organizations how to do their job. But I think it goes both ways as well. There's obviously an implicit power dynamic, which all of us need to be very aware of. But sometimes philanthropists have a bird's eye perspective, or a perspective from a different sector, from the private sector, that's helpful to the organization as well, where they see many organizations in a field and not just an individual one. So I think, if possible, that dialogue being open and honest, which is very difficult to do given the implicit power dynamic, is really the best thing for all involved.
So I would say, if you want to respond to an immediate crisis, the best way to do that is to give no strings attached funding. If you want to ensure the survival of an essential institution in the Jewish community, the best way to do that is unrestricted funding. If you care about effectiveness and impact of your investments, the best way to ensure effectiveness and impact is unrestricted funding. And if you care about long-term systems change, the best thing you can do is give long-term unrestricted funding. You got to respect the leaders like Rachel, who are making it happen every day. Of course, offer your advice. Of course, offer your expertise. Of course, offer your connections. But don't force your own vision for what's going to work on leaders like Rachel, who are already making it work. You made it work when you had no money at all, Rachel, and you're making it work now that you're a major nonprofit.
I'll just jump in to add to that, Kathy. Like, in our early days, there were maybe one or two funders. There were foundations, but individuals who had created the wealth on their own, who took such time to get to know us. And whenever they did give us a significant grant that had some strings attached, those strings were, I want 3 more people on your board. I want a 3-year strategic plan. It wasn't prescriptive. It was very much like, we'll give you half of this now, and the other half when you do these things that you can do however you want. But providing that kind of like basic guidance. And I think on this note, being able to continue listening to people on the ground is so important. And this notion of, my parents are immigrants from Iran, came to the US after the revolution, and the experience that Jews who have come to the US more recently in the past 30, 40, 20, 10 past year are different than the experiences and needs of Jews in the past. So as we ask, how do we make sure these institutions sustain themselves and are still there? We also need to ask, are they meeting the needs? We're very responsive to Russian Jews and the needs of Russian Jews as they came to the US. How is it, as Jennifer mentioned, the demographics of the Jewish community changing, and how are we continuing to meet the needs, as opposed to assuming the institutions need to stay the same and be funded the same way?
I'll just add, there are a lot of really interesting giving vehicles out there. You mentioned some of them, Liz. And in addition, we're not the only game in town. the nonprofit sector. And we're not the only game in town, the Jewish community. There are a lot of ways to do good in the world, and you don't even have to do it with the nonprofit sector. Like we see all the time donors who are doing social impact investing, getting a return on their investment, investing in bonds, like so many different ways that people can actually make the world better. And I think we all need to have a little humility, and that we don't own the marketplace anymore. And the critical factor here is when having conversations about a vehicle, really making sure you're thinking about to what end. And I think Kathy's point, first of all, I thank you for saying that out loud, because that's a dream of every fundraising professional for you to say that out loud. So thank you. But really, like when someone says to me what they really want to do is start like a social impact, investing program at our federation, like I kind of want to get to why. And what about that feels good in a way that doesn't feel good to continue the way that they are giving? And like, how can we, collapse that difference and really to understand like what our role is in this sector. And I think it's just important to know, like people are doing good everywhere. Like it's not only through us and with us in the Jewish community. So just add that.
So we've been focused, trying to focus kind of long-term in the future, but we also have a number of questions in the Q&A about the more short-term future, particularly on a few issues. So let's just, maybe we'll dive into those for a few minutes. So the first one is COVID, right? Like what have we seen? I guess I have two questions. One is like, what have we seen in response to COVID this year that might indicate something about the future, right? And so I'm thinking both in terms of the way that major foundations and federations have responded, but also in terms of the rise of mutual aid societies and the way that people have really just, sort of stepped up to help their neighbors. But then also there's a question like, what might we need to do, I guess, over the next, I don't know what it's going to be, 5 years, as maybe that's optimistic of me to think, as the nation and the world begins to sort of turn the tide and heal from COVID. So that's a big question, but I've seen many questions. I think it's on all of our minds at this moment. So anyone who wants to can hop in there.
I'll start us off. First of all, there's a massive and growing wealth disparity in this country. I'm not going to speak for Canadians. I'm sure there are many on the call, but I'm not a Canadian expert. So if someone else wants to chime in on the chat, but I mean, you don't have to be a genius to understand that. And that continues. People who were struggling before are struggling in a greater percentage before. And people who are wealthy before are doing better now. Like there is just, those things are both true and they're incredibly complex. I think that in terms of our own kind of outreach to donors, and we don't know where we're going to be finding someone, you just have to lead with empathy. I saw one of the questions in the chat, like how can we be, thinking about fundraising when we might be reaching out to somebody who they themselves needs help? And like the first step always has to be, how can we help? And if you're in a position to give, we want to welcome you to give. And I think people respond to that. I'll say also that, one of the things that I think we're seeing in the COVID situation is that there's Maslow's hierarchy in our community too. And like first and foremost, we have to make sure that people can have access to basic needs, that they can have a warm place to live, that they have access to food, they can feed their family, they can, not become evicted from their apartment. Like we have to take care of that first. And then there's going to come a point where we might pick up our heads and think, but what happened to the rest of the community? And I do have concerns about, I think we have an ability to make sure that people have access to basic needs and will not go hungry. That's our first and foremost responsibility. But we don't want to pick our heads up in 3 years and find out that we don't have Jewish arts and culture, that we don't have Jewish education, that we don't have vibrant ways for people to connect to Jewish identity. And so we have to really find a balance during this COVID period of doing both. And I think Kathy was the first on this call to say yes and. I feel like everything in my job is yes and, that we need people who want to help us ensure that our community can survive. And that also means through the other lens of Jewish identity building, Jewish connectivity, and certainly the other ways that matter to the richness of this community.
On that last point for Jewish identity building, I feel like amid all the horrors of COVID, it actually has created a tremendous opportunity for people wanting connectedness in a different way. I think the mental health aspects of COVID have been somewhat overlooked, in my opinion. A tremendous sense of loneliness and people looking for community. And the Jewish community is certainly a place where folks who in many ways would be unaffiliated otherwise are looking. And I think there are a number of organizations that have done a great job of capitalizing on this and providing community for people who are really seeking it out. A bit just about what I've seen in our portfolio, we have about 130 plus grantees. The folks who we've seen are hit hardest are basically three categories. Ones who are dependent on a lot of small donations as opposed to big chunks. Second, those who are dependent on live events, gala dinners, things like that. And third, those who are dependent on earned revenue. So folks like JCCs, for instance, and that to me is the greatest irony because so many of us on the funder side have been encouraging organizations for years to create more earned revenue streams. And now it's kind of hurting us in the end. So, I mean, certainly here in the Bay Area and across the country, there's a tremendous amount of need. I agree with everything Jennifer said, but I think there will be opportunities for mergers and to think more broadly about like which organizations should exist and are relevant in different ways, and can we collaborate in different ways. And sometimes necessity is the best way to spur this kind of innovation, and it happens as a result of a very difficult time, and but hopefully we'll emerge stronger and leaner and serving the community in the most efficient way possible afterwards.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Dylan. I'd add a fourth group of nonprofits that is really struggling in these times, and it's those who are dependent upon government contracts of any kind, right? Because we're going to be looking, if we're not already, at major budget cuts, certainly at the local and state levels, but we probably are not going to be able to continue this level of federal spending either. So that kind of leads me to think, look, we're not going back to what it was before. What we had before is gone, right? And things will not just go back to normal once there is a vaccine. I think that COVID has laid bare every fissure and every inequity that we have, not just in American society, but in Israel. They are going through very similar things, right? And so I think that the organizations that are going to thrive in the future are those who are going to be able to figure out how we come back better than before. Like, is it really okay with us that a very small percentage of the population is getting richer and richer and richer and everyone is getting poorer? Is that really okay? Is it really okay with us that we're starving arts and culture organizations right now? I think that we're going to have to make decisions as a Jewish community about who and what we want to be going forward. There's going to have to be a lot of innovation. There will be a lot of messiness. I think federations, and I go back to Ray Ringgold's wonderful part in the video where she says, federations are hubs of innovation. And you all can help us figure it out. Help us envision what that Jewish future is going to be, just as you always have.
And I'll just jump in to add that I have the honor of serving on the board of my synagogue, IKAR, in Los Angeles. And I think thinking about how COVID has impacted like local communities and how individuals who are big givers I've seen so many step up in our community, people who are looking community who weren't giving in the past, stepping in and sponsoring our production of high holiday services. So I think alongside those like beautiful moments for local communities to build digital hubs and for new people to step in, there's also been a lot of like fear around what is going to happen to communities where that kind of support and funding isn't available, where people have been hit really hard. And so I think that a lot of this is to be seen, especially at the local synagogue level.
Well, you all have been like getting along and be doing a lot of yes anding, so I'm going to throw you a curveball with apologies to our Canadian friends and colleagues, and B, apologize to you for not prepping you for this one. But I'm curious, like just in terms of thinking about the role of philanthropy in the near future, because it does seem that like there's a lot of questions about what the next 1 to 5 years look like. Do you, without asking you to, be partisan or make any predictions, do you think will be a role for philanthropy in post-election United States? Certainly, regardless of what happens, there will be some chunk of this country that feels deeply alienated and disappointed with the results. And so is that a role for philanthropy? Is it not a role for philanthropy? How do you think about that piece?
Well, I'll jump in. I think there's absolutely a role for philanthropy because I think philanthropy needs to step in when society is feeling stuck and needs to move forward in some way. I also think philanthropy is uniquely suited to funding innovation, which we desperately need right now. Nobody has the answers to this horrific polarization, right, that's plaguing our country. So a couple of concrete things that looks like. The Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, for example, I think they've recently renamed, but they are pursuing efforts to build bridges and bridge divides across communities at the local, state, and national levels. I think that work will be desperately needed. And I think federations, given their central role within not just Jewish community, but within their broader communities, are ideally positioned to engage in those kinds of efforts. I also think that we are going to see, particularly as government becomes more and more strained in responding to people's needs, we're going to see a real need to encourage more individual giving. And what that may look like is making a charitable tax deduction universal. I think there will be another round of tax reform. There has to be at this point. And I think that looking at ways and working as an organized philanthropic sector to make sure that giving remains and is even more so a tax advantaged activity so that more people can give, I think will be very important.
So for us as a foundation, just to build on what Kathy was saying, this has actually been a priority of ours for about 4 years since the 2016 election. I think we started by focusing on the area of misinformation because we saw from a nonpartisan perspective, there were quite a few people in 2016 who were inside the voting booths and making up their mind who to vote for based on factually incorrect information. So that became a big area of grant making. And one of the things we've really been focusing on is reducing polarization in this country over the past 4 years and around the world. I mean, we interpret it in different ways. There's certainly in a non-Jewish context, conspiracy theories, misinformation, people becoming further and further apart politically. We've made a number of grants to try to get thoughtful, moderate, centrist voices empowered because sometimes they're drowned out by more extremist voices, but also around the world, fighting anti-Semitism here and in Europe, whether it's on the left or on the right, exposing radicalism and looking at moderates all around the world has really been a focus of our foundation from the start. And I think it's even more relevant than ever in this country, more so than ever, that thoughtful centrist voices are not drowned out by much louder clickbait sort of extremist voices, both on the far left as well as the far right.
I'll jump in with our first piece of pushback, which is I think we're in a moment when centrist voices are not helpful. We're in a moment when I think we've been deprived of visionary leadership. There are so many incredible leaders in our Jewish community, but they've been put into a box and told if you speak out on anything that might potentially have any political leaning, you'll be crucified. And so there's no leadership that's actually visionary and compelling. I mean, there is, don't get me wrong, but we don't have enough of it, right? If there was, we wouldn't be left looking for these voices and being attracted to conspiracy theories that give us answers and give us comfort and community that we so desperately need. And one of my friends, Jason, who works at the LA Federation, shared the freeandfair.org, which is a campaign from the, I think, Lippman Canfor Foundation, about making educational resources that are nonpartisan more available in our Jewish community, equipping Jewish leaders to feel prepared to speak up and create a sense of trust in our system. I think so much of the polarization is a result of not trusting things and too much news and on every side, right? So how are we equipping our Jewish leaders to feel comfortable to step into these things that are on all of our minds and in all of our hearts? And I think right now we need to give permission to people to have vision so that we can be attracted to them, right? I don't know if anyone else has been encouraged to read the piece on Why Stories Matter by Marshall Gans. I know I read it in my first AJWS training, right? There's a piece that says, we tell stories that demonstrate our values, because when we demonstrate our values, it triggers something in someone else to know why they too might care, why they too might step up and lead. And I think if we're not getting conversations about these important moments about our democracy, about politics, about people's lives from our Jewish leaders, then we are going to go and find those stories that are compelling and have value somewhere else. So I think like Free and Fair and other campaigns that give Jewish leaders some protection and an invitation to step up are so important. Otherwise it becomes irrelevant. We'll find it somewhere else.
Thank you. So I think someone, Jennifer, it might have been you who first mentioned the diversity of Jewish communities across North America and really around the world, and either the, sort of the combination of the growing recognition of the diversity and the growing diversity. I believe both of those are happening. And I'm just curious, like when folks look at the face, particularly of what the Jewish community might look like in generations to come, how do you imagine that might shift giving and philanthropy?
Oh, also a hard question. Look, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know. What I hope is that if we lead with our values and what we care most about as a community, I think we will ensure a better opportunity for everyone to feel included. I think that right now, if you look around the Jewish community and you compare it to probably actual data of who are the members of the Jewish community, like, I don't think you'll see everybody represented. And in fact, I think about myself in many ways, not my external identity markers, but my internal identity markers. That if you had told me when I was 17 that I would have had 3 kids that went to Jewish day school and would be running a federation, I would have said to you, what's Jewish day school? What's Jewish? Like, I just had no framework for any of those words. And here I find myself, decades later. And so I think we really have to address what we mean by the our in our community, and who do we intentionally mean to include in that. And that includes all different kinds of diversity: socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, identity diversity, geographic diversity. And I think the important thing there, though, is to really be clear about our organizational identities. Sometimes we fall into the trap of like, we should just be a model UN and make sure we have one of everything here represented. And I don't think that's honest either, because that's not really about who we want to be as a community and making sure that everyone feels included. We have to do both. And so I hope our community looks different. I feel like it already does, to be completely honest. When I watched the video, most of what I wanted to say is like, I feel like the future is here. I feel like it's not 10 years away. Like, it feels here, at least in my community. And it feels like people are agitating for change in a way that is productive and actually making openings and inroads for that change. And, maybe the people in my generation just need to get out of the way a bit more. So that's what I would say.
Other thoughts about that? Go ahead, Rachel.
On the generation getting out of the way, I feel like, in fact, we need our generations to be working more closely, right? I have mentors who every day tell me, take off your rose-colored glasses, become a little bit more hard-nosed, right? I need that sort of influence in my life. So I think the goal is really, how do we create tables where intergenerationally we can learn and work together, especially when it comes to investing major dollars.
Here in the Bay Area, we did what we called a community portrait a couple of years ago. And one of the most amazing takeaways to me, and I apologize if I butchered the statistic, there are probably people on the call who know it a lot better than I do. It was 25% of Jewish households in the Bay Area had a person of color living in the household. And this was an amazing thing, because I think all of us knew that the JOC community was a growing one and a very important one to engage, but 25% was a lot higher than any of us thought. And I think for me personally, and for a lot of other folks, it's difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of how does it feel to be an outsider in the Jewish community looking in, and how do we make it a welcoming environment for that. And I think one of the great promising things we have recently is Arthur Slepian took over as president of the JCSSF on July 1st. And being a member of the LGBT community, he remembers years ago when, being gay, he was on the outside looking in. So he knows how that feels, and it's been a priority of his to engage the JOC community. So I think having that sort of empathy, thinking about what members of the Jewish community are out there who don't feel welcome, and how can we really understand where they're coming from and meet them where, I think is really critical.
You know, it's funny. I grew up in LA in the 70s and 80s. And when I think about the fights within the Jewish community then, it was how do we reckon with the Holocaust and its implications for our people. It was endless fights about interfaith marriage. And because I was the product of an interfaith marriage, I felt those pretty personally and pretty acutely. It was about, could women be on the bima, right? I mean, it was those fights. And now I tell my children that those were the fights. And my, children who have been to day school and have a really strong Jewish identity are like, you're kidding, that's so dumb, right? So I don't know that I can predict what the fights will be. I can kind of see them coming, right? You can see fights about observance. You can see fights about Israel. You can see fights about all kinds of things that threaten the unity of our community. But the fact is, there have always been fights that threaten the unity of the Jewish community. And at the end of the day, we're all still Jews. We're all still here, right? And so I think the challenge is, as Dylan said, is really to make sure how we respect belief and keep room for open debate and even for some fighting. Because at the end of the day, you're a family and it's not going to be any easier than going home for Thanksgiving to your family. You've got to figure out a way to make it work.
Thank you. So on a different, I want to shift gears just a little bit because I feel like we've spoken a lot about our, everyone's spoken a lot maybe from their professional affiliations, right? But I know also all of you are donors involved in things personally. And one of the things we really talk about all the time in the work I do is that like everyone can make a difference regardless of how much they can give. And actually there were a couple questions also in the Q&A about that sort of like, okay, but what does this mean for, everyday people in the future? Like so I'm curious, like when you take off your work hat and you put on your personal hat, if we can do that anymore in these Zoom days, I'm not sure, but you spin around 3 times in your office and then you're home. How do you think that your giving might change in the decades to come, or that of your families if you have a family? How does this affect you as a person who likely doesn't have, I don't want to make assumptions about any of you, but I don't believe any of you are giving away millions and billions of dollars personally.
When my husband first said to us, let's set up a DAF, I said, you're crazy. We're not rich. Like, we're not going to set up a DAF. He's like, you need $5,000 to set up a DAF. And I said, okay, right? So I think that the advent of donor advised funds democratizes giving for a whole lot of people. And I think we should continue to lean into that, to encourage that. One of the most positive developments in philanthropy I saw this year was, I believe it was Fidelity saying, it's not going to have to be a $5,000 minimum anymore to open up a DAF. And I think if you really want to engage your children and your grandchildren in giving Jewishly, you will really encourage parents to set up DAFs for their kids. And I think there are some federations who've already done this, but I think that really harnessing the power of our current tax code to make giving something that you can do even if you're not wealthy, and do in a really systematic way and do collaboratively with and through your federation, I think there's enormous potential there.
I personally shifted all of my giving that was ever going to anything institutional, i.e. like a budget of $1 million or more. And I'm giving it entirely to organizations that are local and underfunded. And I mean, I think after COVID, we saw these massive institutions get every corporate sponsor and raise an incredible amount of money. And we haven't talked about like big philanthropy yet, right? The notion that our democracy is being influenced by philanthropy, who can just pour however much money in towards one direction or another. And so as an individual, I know that by investing in small local organizations or even just grassroots, even if they're big, but they're very grassroots, I'm not only giving them funds to fuel their work, but I'm fueling their team. I know that that donation matters to them and it matters to their board.
So I'll say, I think that, like everything in life, everybody goes through these developmental phases. And I had the phase of life where anybody who was doing a run or a jog or a walk, you know, those are the things you give to, because your engagement with philanthropy was really the way to have a social network, to connect to friends and family. And I cared about the things that they cared about. I had probably like a good decade and a half of that kind of giving in my life. And it felt pretty good. You know, it introduced me to a network of people who cared about really interesting things, that some of whom have stuck with me over the years. And I think that one of the questions that we ask in our family is, it's not just about what difference can these dollars make, because you're right, Liz, like the amount of money that we're giving away is relatively, you know, incremental to any size organization, but it's what difference can we make? And how do our dollars get leveraged with other families and other people who care about the things that we care about? And I think the beauty of Federation is that 1 + 1 = 3. And, you know, when we make a gift to our Federation, I feel that we're at the balcony level, and I don't know about all the people in need in our community. And I do not know about every small organization who is struggling. I don't have the capacity to know that. I'm not wearing my work hat, I'm wearing my person hat. At work I do, but as a person. And I'm grateful that there's a system that allows me to join with other people to make a bigger difference. And I feel really grateful for that. I think for a lot of people to do the research, to figure it out, you know, where they can make an inroad is really challenging. And so I don't mean to be a advertisement for Federation, because certainly there are many other, you know, organizations that function in a similar way. So not at all, but, you know, if you think about how will my single dollar make a difference anywhere, it can be really, you know, doesn't make you feel that great. But when you think about how my single dollar plus my voice, plus my volunteering, plus the things that I care about, combined with thousands of other people who feel the same way, then you start to feel like we're really moving towards something. We're moving towards making a real difference together. And so I think that's really important to our family.
I think for us, similar to what's been said, it's been a great opportunity on a yearly basis to have a bit of introspection for my wife and I to just kind of sit back and reflect on what's important to us, what are our values, what are our philanthropic priorities on our limited budget, and to go through that exercise and think about, okay, what do we really deeply care about? And similar to what's been said, I think to a certain extent wearing a slightly different hat as a personal funder, since the amounts are so much smaller, thinking about it really in a humble way about how can we chip in and help just a little bit to organizations we think are doing good work and are aligned with our values. And also thinking about it on an individual organizational level, where I think a lot of how I sort of think about philanthropy professionally is thinking about a portfolio in an area. So if we're giving to Europe and we have, you know, 20 something grantees in that space, what are we trying to accomplish at large with that portfolio of 20 something grantees in Europe? Whereas individually, it's much more about, here's a great organization doing good work. How can we chip in a way that reflects what matters to us as a family?
Thanks. So we're gonna do one more question, then we're gonna do some wrap up and let everyone take a little break before the plenary tonight, which looks amazing. So the last question I have for you before we wrap up is, we haven't talked at all really about technology. Right? It was just interesting at this moment where we're spending all of our time attached to, you know, the little computers in our pockets. So anyone have any thoughts about the role of technology in giving in the future, whether that's, you know, connected with, you know, digital campaigns or crowdfunding or any of those kinds of things? Thoughts about how that might shift?
I'll jump in to share that again at ICAR, my synagogue, during high holidays, in addition to, you know, putting the link in the chat for people to give, we added our Venmo. And I think we had like more than 100 donations come in through people just Venmoing, because they're sitting right there, account's already set up, don't have to put in your email address or anything. So I think because people can just give in anyway, so that was pretty amazing. And then I'll also add that I think because we're using technology more, we're less geography bound. So we're able to bring people together in giving circles that are not as geography bound and more interest bound in other ways.
I think, you know, I have a 12th grader who's applying to colleges that he's never seen. and also sitting Shiva for senior year of what was supposed to be in his life that's not. And I am constantly trying to hold up the mirror to him and say, like, this is not that bad. Like, there are so many silver linings from this situation. You can imagine how a cranky 17-year-old takes that dinner conversation, but you know what? There are so many silver linings here. And I'm not being Pollyannish. I know that people are really suffering. I see them every day. And I agree with Rachel, like, we have broken down the walls of accessibility. And so technology has helped us reach people who never in a million years would have shown up at our doors. Any of our doors would never walk in. They're thinking, will I be welcomed? Will I belong? Am I the right kind of Jew for this thing? Will I know anybody? Who will I talk to in the cocktail hour? Like, I do this for a living and I have those panic thoughts every time I park my car to go into some Jewish communal event. And you know, we've made it so open and accessible, Jewish learning at everyone's fingertips. And we have to really hold on to that extremely tightly. The place of technology in fundraising, I think, I love Rachel's example of making it super easy. We should make it really easy for people to give. And technology, I'm not a technology person, but I know technology can help us. But I'm kind of old school in the relational space. And I think if we leave it at technology, we won't have these donors sitting around the table in a meaningful way in 3, 5, and 10 years. The technology has to be the entry point to a really authentic, meaningful relationship. You know, I've had hundreds of donor meetings since March 12th, I think was my last day in the office, over Zoom. And in some ways, they've been even better than when we used to meet in person. And they've been incredibly personal. I've been Zoomed into people's living rooms. I've met with donors at all levels, $18 all the way up to $9 million. And it is that personal relationship, the authentic relationship, that really matters in philanthropy. And it's absolutely going to be the thing that people remember further down the road. So I think it has to be a combination of using technology to allow us to connect to people we never would have had access to before, and then taking those relationships in an authentic direction for a longer time period.
Just an example to add to I agree with what's already been said. You know, we, like many foundations, you know, fund trips to Israel sometimes. And that to me is the most interesting example of something where it was just a given that the best way to experience Israel is to get on a flight and to go there at any age, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever sort of target audience you're thinking about. And there's been obviously a lot of forced innovation, not only recently, but you know, it will continue for the foreseeable future. So how do you help people experience Israel in a virtual way? What are different things you can do? And as we can see here, there are 500 plus people on this call. I went to the GA a couple of years ago. I don't think there were 500 in too many breakout sessions. So it's great to be able to reach so many more people. And how can you make that experience meaningful and emotional and relevant, particularly when you're talking about something like Israel, when the given and the assumption has been for so many years that you have to go there in person. So I think in as much as far as innovation, it could be a tremendous blessing.
I think that Liz, you wanted disagreement, so I'm gonna end on a disagreement. I think Israel is a great example of the limits of technology. Yes, there's been a lot of forced innovation. Yes, that has resulted in people having lots of different ways to access and experience Israel. And there is still never going to be a replacement for going there, right? And you get a depth of understanding and feeling for Israel when you're in the country that you will never get, no matter how many Zoom presentations you sit through, right? So I think this is going to, I think coming back to something that Jennifer said, this pandemic is going to make us more appreciative of community. And technology can be a great accelerator for community. It can be a great filler of gaps and substitute when we can't be together in person. But in the end, we're a Jewish community. We want to be together in person. And I think we'll understand the value of that and appreciate it even more coming out of this pandemic.
So thank you all so much. As Dylan and Jennifer, as you both said, we're sitting with, I don't know, around 500 people here, which is just extraordinary. Thank you everyone for signing on. I know it's late on a Sunday and sometimes a Zoom webinar can be really exhausting. And we're sorry we couldn't do more kind of interactive conversation with you. But I want to just give all of you and all of our panelists an opportunity. What like, what final thoughts do you have? What should these folks know about the future of giving, from whatever perspective you want to take? If there's something you didn't get to during this conversation or something you want to re-emphasize, what's important for people to know as they imagine the future of philanthropy? And yeah, how would you like to close? So we'll start, let's start with you, Rachel, and then we'll go around.
I feel like I'm the least qualified to answer this question as a person who is not in philanthropy professionally.
I feel like you're the most qualified to answer this question because most people are not in philanthropy professionally. So
I think that some of the things that are in my mind, and you can even call them fears potentially, are what happens after 1 or 2 years from now when the economy, we really start to see the impact. What happens to democratic philanthropy? How do we make sure that everyday people can give and causes that are not receiving major gifts are able to stick around? Thinking a lot about what does the future of that look like? Thinking a lot about how we make sure that those, Brian Stevenson has this brilliant piece in his book, Just Mercy, where he says, those who are most proximate, you have to be proximate to those that are experiencing whatever injustice, because when you're proximate to them, you have the urgency to act. You have the willpower to push back when, our students who say, we need a Swipe Out Hunger program now because our friends are hungry now, and their school says, come back to us in 3 months when we'll be finished with the campaign, we'll be ready to talk about this. And they get up there and they go on a hunger strike and they say, no, our friends are hungry now. That's a sense of urgency that when I see foundations have hundreds of millions of dollars lying around and they're only giving the 5%, what other urgency do you need, right? So I'm thinking a lot about, in this moment with so many urgent causes, how can more people step up and give with those leaders who are actually proximate? You don't need to get proximate, but invest in people who are, so that we can inform a Jewish future that is representative, again, of not where we have been, but where we are now and where we're going.
Thanks. Kathy?
Speaking as someone who does work for a philanthropy that's sitting on billions of dollars, I can say I don't think we're the future. I think that individual givers working collectively and harnessing that technology to increase their impact through collective giving, I think that you're the future. Go make it happen.
That's beautiful. I think, again, as we spoke about before, I think the empowerment of philanthropists connecting directly with organizations is a wonderful thing. It gives meaning to philanthropy. But at the same time, I hope that philanthropists will continue to trust the professionals, be they federation professionals leading donor advised funds, foundation professionals, others in the community who really are on the ground and know what's happening, to try to reduce the arbitrary nature of philanthropy. And at the same time, democratization is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, I think, as Rachel mentioned before, having a small handful of people with vision who really see how things can go and are not afraid to shake things up and push us in a direction is something we need to reconcile with a large-scale democratization of any effort. But I think all these things together, I think we have a bright future for this, and the fact that so many people are involved philanthropically who never would have thought they could be previously is a beautiful thing.
So I'll end with one of my core beliefs is that Jewish people giving to Jewish organizations is a core and critical expression of Jewish identity. And for many members of our community, it's the only expression they make towards their Jewish identity. And we have a lot of work to do in that arena. And I feel just like the sheer number of people who are standing up and waving their hands and saying, I want to join you. I want to be part of this project. I think this thing called Jewish community and the structures we have in place are worth fighting for. Of course, we should pivot and change and innovate, and they should look different. But the core of who we are as a community is worth fighting for. And I feel deep hope and gratitude for that and for the opportunity to serve our community.
I cannot thank you all enough. When they asked me to do this, really, I just started to say to myself, okay, like if I could get people together in person and we could, you know, hang out and have a cocktail or a mocktail and haggle over these issues, who are the people I would want? And you were the folks that came to mind. So thank you all so much. Thanks to JFNA, for hosting this conversation in and of itself. I think it's really an indicator that JFNA and the federations are both fighting, just for what you said, Jennifer, to like preserve the community now and deeply, deeply thinking about what the community looks like in the future. And thanks to Carolyn for kicking us off. I hope that all of you are going to join us at the plenary this evening and the plenary tomorrow, and there's tons of other great workshops. So with that, we will wrap, I think. And I actually now will just say embarrassedly, I'm not totally sure how I technically do that, but thanks for joining us, everyone, and come back soon.